There are many different ways to make different styles of focaccia. Some of them require a Polish made the night before, some require an overnight proof, some will require an extended amount of kneading either by hand or by a mixer. This recipe we're doing today is what I genuinely think is the best method of all, considering how easy it is. In this recipe, we're going to be using baker's percentage. This is the best and most accurate way to make bread because it can give you the most consistent results. We will be measuring everything in this recipe today in grams, so if you don't have a kitchen scale like this, definitely consider investing in one of these. A good ones usually go for about $30, and I'll leave a link down below for one that I recommend. So when it comes to baker's percentage, the total amount of flour will always be 100%, and the rest of your ingredients will be percentages based off your 100% of flour. With our focaccia, we're going to be using 83% hydration, 2% salt, and 1% instant yeast. You can adjust your recipe easily depending on how big of a recipe you want to make with some simple math. Today, I'll be using 750 grams of all-purpose flour, and 83% of 750 means I'll be using 623 grams of water. 2% salt means 15 grams, and 1% yeast means 7.5 grams yeast. I'm going to talk about one more huge benefit of using baker's percentage later in this video. Alright, so like I said, this recipe is ridiculously easy. Step number 1, we're going to combine all of our ingredients into a large mixing bowl. Flour, room temperature water, salt, and yeast. Stir this using a fork until you don't see any dry bits of flour. This should only take you about a minute and no more than 2. Cover your dough with plastic wrap and let this sit for 1 hour. So far, step 1's pretty easy, right? Let's talk about temperature. Yeast is a very temperature sensitive thing. When it's cold, the yeast works very slowly, and when it's warm, it thrives. But when it gets too hot, it dies. Very similar to how bacteria works, and obviously they're not the same thing, so don't worry about getting food poisoning or something. Anyways, this recipe will be a slightly longer process because we will be performing a bunch of stretch and folds, which I'll get to in a bit. If you want to speed this recipe up, which is totally okay, during the first step, instead of room temperature water, use warm water. I'm purposely extending the fermentation process because the longer you ferment your dough without overproofing, the more flavor it develops. That's why most artisan breads like sourdough and baguettes require a cold overnight proof in the fridge. Alright, step number 2. Unwrap your plastic wrap carefully because you'll need it again. Chop about 1.5 tablespoons of fresh rosemary and sprinkle on top of your dough. We're going to wet our hands lightly with some water so the dough won't stick to our hands as much. And gently grab one of the corners of your dough, stretch it upwards without tearing your dough, and fold it over just like this. Quite literally a stretch and fold. This technique is used very commonly in bread making. Rotate your bowl each time and repeat in all corners. This should take you about 5 to 6 stretch and folds. Cover your dough again and let this proof for another hour. If you're using warm water during step 1, let this proof for 30 to 45 minutes instead. Now, because this is a no-knead recipe, we need to somehow create gluten structure and strength, which is why we perform all these stretch and folds. Otherwise, if you have a weak dough, it's gonna come out like a pancake. We're going to repeat step 2 for 3 more times, so in total of 4 rounds of stretch and folds. Each time you will notice when you stretch your dough, it becomes more elastic and you're able to stretch further without the dough tearing. That means the gluten structure is getting stronger. Alright, so this is my 4th time doing my stretch and fold after about 4 hours. As you can see, the dough is nice and stretchy. We're going to do our final round of stretch and fold. This time we don't need to let it proof for another hour in the bowl. I'm going to set up a baking sheet with parchment paper on top. We're going to drizzle some good extra virgin olive oil all over and transfer my dough onto my baking sheet, having the seam side down. Then drizzle a bit more olive oil on top of your dough and slightly smear it so nothing sticks. Cover your dough and let it rest for 1 hour. We want our dough to be nice and relaxed before we move on to our next step. While we're waiting for our final proof, we're going to preheat our oven at 450 degrees Fahrenheit. After about 1 hour, if you shake your tray and it jiggles like this, it's ready to our final step. We're going to oil our hands and we're going to strategically dimple and stretch our focaccia. Starting from the middle section, which is the thicker part, and we're going to gently dimple and stretch our dough from the middle towards the outside. Our goal here is to have the thickness of our focaccia as evenly as you can without disturbing too much of the air pockets, so it cooks and bakes evenly and stays fluffy and airy. Once you're happy with the dimples, drizzle some more extra virgin olive oil on top and finish off with some flaky Maldon sea salt. Pop this into our preheated oven at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 25 to 30 minutes. Depending on your oven, you may want to rotate your tray halfway through. One more quick thing about baker's percentage. You realize when you're making any breads, a few things will almost always be the same. For example, for sure your flour will always be 100% because that's how that works. Salt is always at 2 to 2.5%. And yeast is always at 1%. The only thing that would change would be the hydration. Typically, the higher the hydration, the more difficult the recipe is, and the dough gets more difficult to work with. Hydration usually ranges from 60% and up to 100%. Some doughs can also be enriched with oils, fats, and eggs like brioche and burger buns. After 25 minutes or until you have a beautiful, deep golden brown crust like this, carefully take it out of the oven and transfer your loaf onto a wire rack to cool. Cooling your bread on a wire rack is crucial, otherwise as it cools, the steam from the bottom will be trapped and your bread could potentially go soggy or even gummy. The first 10 to 15 minutes or so, the top of your focaccia is going to feel hard and crusty. But don't worry, as it cools, the moisture will eventually soften your bread. It's also going to be pretty difficult to resist not cutting into it and eat it right away while it's hot. But trust me, it will be better if you let it cool completely or wait at least until it's barely warm. Check out how soft and bouncy this focaccia is. Thanks to all those stretch and folds we did earlier, creating all that gluten strength and structure. So that's it guys, enjoy your focaccia as is, or what you can do is slice it, drizzle some olive oil on top, grill it, serve it with some white wine mussels or meatball marinaras, or you can make some avocado toast with it and maybe even put some poached eggs on top. Give this recipe a try, it's super simple with very little active time. If you guys do, make sure you post them on Instagram and tag me at Cal's Day Off. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for more future content. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.